Hey everyone, today we're going to be continuing our lecture series on Thomas Pynchon's secondary literature reviews. And this time we're going to be looking at this very short, and it's only about 12 pages, but very exciting and very helpful essay of Brian McHale's Pynchon's Postmodernism. And this is going to focus on explaining what exactly postmodernism means in the context of Pynchon's work, gives us some nice concrete examples of the strategies he uses, and how this connects in various regards to postmodern theory. And he's going to give us this differentiation between postmodernity, which are the historical and cultural conditions that provide the basis for the postmodern style, and then postmodernism are these actual aesthetic forms and practices that come to represent the postmodern period. So these are actually the stuff that fiction is made out of, in a sense, when it comes to penning them on the paper. Now, he begins by talking about some postmodernities, some sort of historical and cultural attitudes and conditions and forces that figure in Pynchon's fiction. And he writes that in an early 1979, an enormously influential account, Lyotard identifies the postmodern condition with a general incredulity toward the master narratives that up until now had underwritten and sustained modern cultural and society in the West. We no longer place our faith, he claimed, in the narratives of progress, enlightenment, and human liberation that served to legitimate modernity. Skeptical of such grand narratives, we postmoderns instead value the self-legitimating language games, or little narratives, petits récits, of local groups, particular institutions, and subcultural enclaves. And I think this is really important because it highlights the historical condition that Pynchon finds himself in, which is commented on a lot implicitly in Gravity's Rainbow, is the failure of the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s. There's this desire, this very kind of anarchic explosion or implosion of society's discontent with authoritarian structures and institutions, this desire for freedom in the face of the catastrophes of 20th century fascism and the realization of the extent to which government power is latent within our lives. But of course, if you look at, for example, May 68 in France, it of course didn't really do what it wanted to do. It failed by all practical standards. And sure, it maybe acted as a post sign for an era, but in the large scale, it didn't really promise, of course, this great revolution that was sort of reabsorbed into the French bureaucratic state. And thus, in place of grand narratives, for example, Marx's notion of dialectical history leading to, as a natural consequence, communism and the liberation of the working class and things like this. Instead, we focus on self-legitimating language games. So these sort of systems which have the consistency of their own, even if they're admittedly fictional. And then these petits récits, the little narratives. So we focus on little isolated patches of land instead of trying to paint with a broad brush. And we're looking at the sort of ways in which very particular groups work. And that is going to make Pynchon's work often be called historiographic metafiction, in which we are kind of doing historical fiction, but in a way in which it makes a meta-commentary on the difference between fiction and reality, fantasy and reality. The next postmodernity that McHale mentions is simulation, and this is coming from Jean Baudrillard's theory of simulacra and simulation, and this notion of the procession of simulacra, which defines postmodernity. And McHale says that by procession of simulacra, and by the way, you might want to check out some of my lectures on Baudrillard if you're concerned or interested about this. Baudrillard means that images of reality, especially mass media images, what we use to think of representations of reality, have come increasingly to precede and preempt reality itself. so that we experience the image, the simulacrum, before and even instead of the reality. And I think this is a really cool way of talking about Pynchon's style, because, for example, in Gravity's Rainbow, you have the character Gerhard von Goethe, and he is a filmmaker tasked with making a propaganda film of sorts. And it is loosely based on Fritz Lang's Die Frau im Mond, The Woman in the Moon, which was a 1929 film in which they find gold, or they suspect that there's gold on the moon, and it's a very long movie, by the way. It's like 2 hours and 45 minutes, and it's a silent film, except there's piano accompaniment, which is actually really good. But they find gold on the moon, so they go to get the gold. And there's this rocket, which many have speculated was one of the big influences in terms of the design of the V2. And if you just look at, for example, this simulacra, this image which is supposed to represent our world, or at least a possible world, a possible technological future, it kind of steps out in front of our future and retroactively creates these realities. It proactively steps in front of itself and makes it such that, for example, the reality that comes to be after the film is based on the film, which is supposed to be an image or a representation. A more modern example you could think of would be, for example, Instagram models, where you are supposed to be a real person first. This is the ideal, is you're a real person first, and then your online persona is that. It's a persona. It's an image of you which is curated somehow. And everybody knows this nowadays, that, the internet image is only one part of it. But for example, for an Instagram model, they don't necessarily, their job is not to have a life separate from their Instagram modeling, their real life, and then their digital life. Their digital life is their real life. And there is no distinction per se between the two, because you're tasked to be as public as you can, to keep up with your fans and stuff like that, such that while you might imagine that there is a real person behind the image, oftentimes the real person is shaped by their desire and their need or their project to make images. And in fact, the image and the real person might as well be equivalent sometimes. So with this theory of simulation, we come to see this natural ambiguation of the relationship, as I mentioned before, between fiction and reality that's going to be played with in Gravity's Rainbow, for example. Because von Goethe's film actually reifies the Herreros coming to the zone to try to get their rocket parts and build their rockets and get back their land and whatnot. So fiction actually creates reality. He mentions that there is also a tendency to disintegrate into a rubble of distinct and unrelated signifiers as a consequence and correlative of the decentering of the postmodern subject. And I think this is really interesting, because this third theme of decentering, we very much see this in Gravity's Rainbow, where as we progress, we see that by the time we get to the counterforce part, the fourth part, there is this complete dissimulation of Slothrop's identity, where he's been scattered all over. He's been broken down instead and scattered, as it says in Gravity's Rainbow. And with Slothrop, we get sort of a poster child for this tendency to scatter into a self that can't be picked up, where all the parts seem to be unable to be held at the same time. There is this oppositional and liberatory possibility for decentered subjectivity. And this is a really interesting thing, because while you could think of this purely pessimistically, that, it's just everything is breaking down, this is apocalyptic. No, there's also some liberatory possibility where with the fractured subject, it is more difficult to capture. He speaks of being capable of offering resistance to forms of domination that require individuals to be self-identical, one thing or another. So this unwillingness to be reduced to a self-identical, self-reflexive thing, and this outwardly clear thing, allows for ambiguities that Pynchon will play with in very exciting ways. And then moving into postmodernisms, so again, these are the aesthetic forms and practices of the postmodern period. One of these that he mentions is double coding. This is where the distinction between, for example, high culture and mass or popular culture that the modernists had striven so hard to maintain and police has finally and definitively broken down. We are trying to straddle or collapse the distinction between, for example, avant-garde experimentalism and popular culture. And, Pynchon is going to do this all the time because, as McHale said, his fiction displays avant-garde difficulty and high cultural elusiveness and calls upon readers to bring to bear more or less esoteric knowledge from a range of demanding specialist fields. But its high cultural demands are counterbalanced by low cultural entertainment value. Pynchon's novels offer all kinds of mindless pleasures, the original title of Gravity's Rainbow, such as puns and wordplay, pornography, cartoon-like pastiche, slapstick humor, chase scenes, songs like the Rocket Limericks, for example. All of this is it appeals to the need to be stimulated, for example, but it does it in a way where it's also undercutting that impulse at the same time. And that undercutting is very central to one of probably the most key aspect of postmodernism, in my opinion, or at least one of the really definable ones, is irony and pastiche. McHale writes, "The postmodern attitude, according to the fiction writer Max Appel, is a mixture of world weariness and cleverness, an attempt to make you think I'm half kidding, though you're not quite sure about what. An ironic attitude, in short, but involving irony of a particularly and peculiarly unfocused or unmoored kind. The postmodern period style, it is generally acknowledged, is ironic, but then so is the modernist style. So how does postmodernist irony differ from the modernist kind? Alan Wilde argues that modernist irony was disjunctive. Striking to recover an ideal integration and coherence, it acknowledged the disconnectedness of things and sought at least to control disconnection, even if it could not ultimately resolve it. Postmodern irony, by contrast, is suspensive. It simply, or not so simply, accepts the world in all its disorder, abandoning the quest for integration altogether. Akin to this understanding of postmodern irony is Jameson's highly influential concept of postmodern pastiche, the imitation of a style or genre without any of the satirical pointedness that characterizes parody. Pastiche is neutral mimicry, lacking parody's ulterior motives, quote-unquote blank parody, as Jameson famously put it. And that's interesting because there is a kind of careful crafting of these cells which appear to be unintegratable. There's, for example, with a capital T in Gravity's Rainbow. There's the Tristero in The Crying of Lot 49. You've got also the White Visitation. You've got all of these different groups and events and ideas which seem like they're on the cusp of giving you something important, but you can't quite bring it all together. But the important word there is all together. You can bring certain things partially together into confluence. They have a natural sort of gravitational attraction to one another, especially as you get acquainted with Pynchon's books by reading them over and over, such that you're able to imitate all these various perspectives and sort of have themselves create an autonomous critique, but in a way where it doesn't necessarily need to be pointed or polemical. It can have an air of funniness or arbitrariness. Now, when talking specifically about Pynchon's world, he mentions that there is a number of shifts we can see emblematically in Pynchon's work that represents postmodern literature as a whole. For example, this is a common one, the shift from epistemology, that being the theory and philosophy of knowledge, to ontology, the theory of being. So we're shifting from how do we know to things like possible worlds, for example. In epistemology, we are geared towards human perception and cognition, the differences in perspective when it comes to knowing, the subjective experience of time, the circulation and unreliability of knowledge. A good example of investigating human perception and cognition is the Proteus episode, or the third episode of James Joyce's Ulysses, where there's this meditation on the relationship when it comes to a sort of phenomenology of perception of sight and hearing, and the ways in which they bring in the world either all at once or sequentially and whatnot. And then the subjective experience of time and the circulation and unreliability of knowledge, a really great one, would be the Circe episode from Ulysses. I think that's the 15th episode. Really crazy, disjointed. We're messing with realities, kind of switching between them. That one has a much more postmodernist feel, but we're focusing on the subjective experience of things and trying to orient ourselves epistemologically within that field. But in ontology, as McHale says, its characteristic techniques and devices are designed to explore issues of fictionality, modes of being and the differences among them, the nature and plurality of worlds, how such worlds are made and unmade, and so on. In shorthand, where modernism was a poetics of epistemology, postmodernism is a poetics of ontology. And some concrete examples of what this ontological investigation looks like in Pynchon's work is, for example, Pynchon is concerned with the nature of the self. Is the self singular and absolute, or is it multiple, disjuncted, confused, and ambiguous? What is reality, for example, when it comes to the Fritz Lang movie that I talked about earlier, Die Frau im Mond? Does the fiction precede the reality and imbue the reality? Is reality as real as we would like to think it? How do things like dreams and analepsis and prolepsis play into this? He's also going to think about, for example, cause and effect and determinism. This figures in the elect and preterite theme of Gravity's Rainbow. And for example, do behaviors always have a one-to-one correspondence with the stimulus before them? Or is there some ambiguity, such as you see in, for example, certain quantum phenomena? And these are the kind of things that, if you listen to the last lecture, for example, Pynchon is trying to bring out. Now, one may hear that postmodernism is concerned more with ontology than epistemology, but you might think, well, what about like Oedipus or Slothrop trying to search for what's really going on? It's like a detective novel. How is that not an epistemological quest, as McHale puts it? And McHale says that while these do figure in the narrative, it's not the primary point. He says that the questioning detective is left in limbo. And that's the important thing. We don't actually get to the end of an epistemological quest or ever really get epistemological certainty. He says that Slothrop's double epistemological quest to discover the fate of Rocket 000 and to uncover the truth of his own upbringing is undertaken in a world that proves to be so volatile and indeterminate, so plural, that the quest is rendered moot. Indeed, as we have seen, the questing detective himself disintegrates. So what's brought to mind here is that epistemological searches for Pynchon become a mere element in a larger metafictional project. So it serves as just one element among others, not the chief reigning element. McHale says that many of Pynchon's characteristic techniques and devices serve to foreground issues of ontology, of worlds and being in those worlds, including strategies for pluralizing worlds, strategies for proliferating levels of reality internal to the story world. A great example of that is Mason and Dixon with the nested narrator idea. Strategies for suspending reality between literal and figurative status, and strategies for exposing to view and troubling the very process of bringing worlds into being. And I think this is another, I'm really glad I read this essay because it really helps explain a lot of Pynchon for me, is McHale mentions one of the key aspects of Pynchon is this idea of plurality of worlds. And there are 4 different conceptions of worlds here. First, there are lost worlds. Second, there are parallel worlds. Third, there are passages between worlds. And fourth, there are visitations from other worlds. And for this first kind of lost world idea, a great example is the hollow earth in Mason and Dixon. It's also in Against the Day, but I haven't read all of Against the Day, so I'm not going to comment on it. But near the end of Mason and Dixon, for example, Mason and Dixon, they hear this idea that instead of the flat earth or the globular earth theory, there is this theoretical model of the earth shaped like a donut, or a torus, I guess, where if you go inside through the poles, you can actually go inside and it sort of folds in on itself, and it's hollow inside, and there's a whole nother society, and the sun wraps around over the horizons of the poles and whatnot, and they get this kind of sunlight coming in like through like a toilet paper tube. And it's this really interesting kind of speculating about, well, what worlds may be lost beyond our perspectives, but because we aren't willing to go out and search for them, we might not find them. When it comes to parallel worlds, these are not as separate as the lost worlds are. There's a sense in which they occur alongside, or have always occurred alongside, the world that we've taken to be the real. For example, the heterotropian multi-world space of the zone in Gravity's Rainbow, where this kind of serves as a background for a bunch of different worlds that can exist in parallel to one another. So these worlds can either be proliferated, or they themselves can be a medium of proliferation for other worlds. I think a good example of that latter one is the wedge in Mason and Dixon and the Lost 11 Days. So the wedge is this kind of mysterious anomaly that occurred when Mason and Dixon were trying to chart the Mason and Dixon line. And they were trying to have all these lines meet perfectly at the right spot, tangent to one another and things like this, or parallel to one, or perpendicular to one another. But there's this little triangular wedge that the ownership is kind of in contention. And Pynchon sets this up at a spot where it seems like anything can happen here, in the same way things do in the zone. And the Lost 11 Days, when we switched over to the Gregorian calendar, there was a skip in 11 days from, I believe, September 2nd to the 14th, I think, something like that. And there's this play on whether or not those 11 days are still there and whether or not they can still be lived. And Mason actually lives through those 11 days in Mason and Dixon at one point. So it's a really interesting example of a world that could potentially always be existing alongside us, but we're just not able to see it. Another example might be the world of constellations in Gravity's Rainbow. And he mentions in Gravity's Rainbow that when the V2 rocket reaches the apex of its parabolic curve, it reaches a Brennschluss point in which the engine cuts off purposefully, or runs out of fuel, kind of depends, but usually it is cut off purposefully, and it starts to sink down, uses the rest of its momentum that it's gained to go to its target. And Pynchon imagines all these Brennschlusses points and imagines, okay, do they already exist in the sky before the rocket has been shot? Because, I mean, hypothetically, if you know the trajectory of the rocket, you can know exactly where that Brennschluss point is. At least in a Newtonian sense, there's probably some quantum indeterminacy if you really try to get 100% precise. But you can basically know where that Brennschluss point is before the rocket has actually reached it. And Pynchon imagines all these Brennschluss points coming together to form a new zodiac sign. He imagines, well, what are all the possibilities of all the points in the sky that we don't think about? And that's a perfect example of a parallel world, such as the sky, for example, that in Mason and Dixon is used as this third kind of point as well, which is a transition world, in which when we go from looking at the sky to the earth, they serve as transitions for one another to allow us to access new worlds. It's like a highway that delivers us somewhere. And then fourth, he talks about these ideas of visitations from other worlds. And we see this all the time. For example, there's angels and other otherworldly visitations in Gravity's Rainbow. In Mason and Dixon, Mason is constantly haunted by his dead wife, Rebecca. They have all sorts of spiritual encounters throughout Mason and Dixon. You also see, for example, cameo appearances and anachronisms that don't really make sense. Or, for example, you have kind of twistings where you have visitations from people who now have a new persona. For example, you have Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson in Mason and Dixon, and they all kind of have new personalities. Some of them are like obsessed with this electricity cult, where it's like this sadomasochistic cult. So you have all of these different migrating characters, even from one novel to the other. For example, one of my favorite Pynchon names, Clayton Bloody Chicklets, comes from The Crying of Lot 49 to Gravity's Rainbow. So you're actually seeing this passage between Pynchon's worlds, which is kind of a microcosm for transferring between Pynchon's world and the reader's world. And then next he mentions this notion of strange loops. McHale says that the narrative world can be pluralized and ontology foregrounded, not only by juxtaposing worlds, but also by layering or stacking them. For instance, by nesting one plane of narrative reality inside another. A narrator at one level tells a story in which a second-order narrator in turn tells a story, and so on, potentially ad infinitum. Or by describing an artwork, real or invented, belonging to a different medium, a painting, play, movie, etc., they're remediating it. An example is the Remedios Varo painting from The Crying of Lot 49. The most complex case of stacking or layering of narrative levels in Pynchon's fiction occurs in Mason and Dixon, where the Reverend Wicks Cherrycoke narrates the adventures of Mason and Dixon, while secondary narrators, who occupy the same level as Mason and Dixon, narrate further double inset stories. Remediation, also called with reference to paintings, ekphrases, occur conspicuously in The Crying of Lot 49, which remediates a real painting of Remedios Varo, a war movie broadcast on television and the performance of a Jacobean revenge tragedy. Internal proliferation through stacking and remediation creates opportunities for a variety of paradoxes that further foreground the story world's ontology. Metalepsies, when the boundary between ontological levels is violated or overrun. Strange loops, when an inset or nested world proves to be continuous with the primary world that frames it. Trompe-l'oeil, when an inset level is mistaken for the primary level. And mise en abîme, when an inset text or artwork mirrors the primary narrative. And there's so much terminology and whatnot going on there. And that really is one of the most difficult parts of reading Pynchon, is this obfuscation of perspective through setting in Confluence several different, often mutually contradictory perspectives and creating strange nested networks within them such that you're not exactly sure how deep you are. It kind of reminds me of like watching Inception or something, where you're going a dream within a dream within a dream, because sometimes you do a dream within a dream in Gravity's Rainbow. McHale continues that as for Pynchon's strange loops, the strangest of them, arguably, involves the captive's tale in Mason and Dixon. The events of the captain's tale seem to be pitched as the same narrative level as Mason and Dixon's adventures, and indeed the tale's heroine and her protector eventually join Mason and Dixon's party. But the captive's tale also forms an episode of the Gothic novel, The Ghastly Fop, which characters throughout Mason and Dixon at all levels are reading. So the captive and her tale exist both at a primary level and at an inset level, a strange loop. And that's really interesting. That was one of the most, disorienting moments in Pynchon's entire oeuvre for me, is understanding what's going on there, because the characters from The Ghastly Fop are both in this book, which is being read inside the book of Mason and Dixon, which you're reading, but then they also simultaneously meet Mason and Dixon, and you're like, wait, I thought they were characters in a story, not real people, real fictional people, but they're kind of both at the same time, and they kind of do these strange register shifts where Pynchon is often just going to disregard the conventional notions of, for example, cause and effect in Gravity's Rainbow. He says that similarly paradoxical, though in a slightly different way, are the opening events of gravity's rainbow, which we initially assumed to be occurring in the real world, but which proved to be Pirate Prentice's nightmare. And that's a great example, because you realize at one point that he's waking up and you're like, oh. And regarding Trente-Louis, he mentions that it is a trick by which we are induced to mistake events at one level of reality for events at another. And I think that's really funny, because sometimes he will just contradict himself and he'll be like, no. Or he'll be like asking you to imagine a scene and then he'll tell you it's black outside. So it's like, oh, so I shouldn't have been able to see anything the whole time, but you were telling me to imagine things the whole time. And then next, McHale talks about figurative worlds. He says that works of postmodern fiction, including Pynchon's novels, often trouble the hierarchy of presence and absence in figurative language, making it difficult to distinguish what is literally there from what is merely figurative. And I really like that, because he mentions that such metaphors becoming literal abound in Gravity's Rainbow, where they expand in size and complexity until they approach the condition of freestanding microworlds, second-order realities that compete with the novel's first-order world. A particularly flagrant example is the figure that begins, living inside the system is like riding in a bus driven by a maniac bent on suicide. And then it continues for a further 25 lines to specify in fine-grained detail the bus driver's manic monologue, the stops on the miniature world, concrete enough to make the reader forget temporarily that it is all just a figure of speech. Moments of ontological hesitation induce a kind of shimmer of indeterminacy, throwing the novel's entire world into doubt, placing it under erasure. And I think that's really cool, because there really is something satisfying and interesting about accepting that position of doubt when reading a Pynchon novel. That is what really let it click for me as I reached, maybe page 120 or so, and I just realized, okay, I don't need to know everything, but I do realize that part of the point is to be obscure. Like, he's clearly not a stupid author, especially by the time you might think for like the first 100 pages of Gravity's Rainbow, like, this is not remotely beautiful. But I remember thinking that, and then I went back and read the first paragraph after I was like, or the first page or 2 pages or whole episode or whatnot after I was like 3/4 of the way through the book, and I was like, this is amazing. How did I not notice this before? And that really is what it's like to engage with the Pynchon work, where by exposing to view the operations by which narrative worlds are made, we also see how they can be unmade, as McHale says. So we're constantly multiplying contradictory sequences, and they're not really able to set in our minds until afterwards. But McHale has a little coda where he talks about, okay, one of the things that Pynchon is really struggling for is cognitive mapping, for this ontological concreteness, assertion, and self-consequentiality. There's an inability for the modern person to feel represented in a quote-unquote democracy or in the space of late capitalism, which space is an ontological and also a temporal, specifically, marker. But in spite of this uncertainty and this reticence in Pynchon, McHale says, however, I want to argue that the complex spatialities of Pynchon's texts, their proliferation of worlds, lateral and alternative, their paradoxes and short circuits, their doubtful, shimmering, on-again, off-again realities, imply different, more constructive possibilities of cognitive mapping. Granted, the spaces of Pynchon's texts are only virtual, not built. They're text-based illusions, not enclosures of glass and steel. But what if we could learn how to navigate these paradoxical spaces, even if only virtually? What if we could become familiar, even comfortable with their strangeness, perhaps to the point of experiencing them as a kind of second nature? Could this conceivably help us come to terms with the all but intractable problems of cognitive mapping in the world at large? If we could come to feel at home in Pynchon's texts, as one might, Jameson imagines, learn to inhabit Gary's house, Is it possible that this might empower us cognitively to begin finding our place and our way in postmodernity itself? And I think that's a really good way to caveat and think about Pynchon. He's providing conceptual strategies for real problems. To me, it kind of feels like finally facing up to a series of dreams one has had one's whole life, but hasn't really delved into and figured out the meaning of. When that occurs, you all of a sudden have a completely different approach to perception, and I must say, that is exactly what Gravity's Rainbow has done for me. I used to never dream, ever, or at least not remember them, I guess is probably what the scientists would say. But after and as I begin reading Gravity's Rainbow, I started having the most vivid, detailed, and rememberable dreams I've ever had in my life, like all the time, still to this day. It completely changed the way my conscious and unconscious mind works. And I think that is the power of Pynchon, that allows for that creative side of the mind to open up and think about more creative solutions. And I think that is one of the most redeemable qualities of Thomas Pynchon's work. So that being said, I hope this has been helpful. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd really appreciate anything you'd like to give. With that being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.